Hey y'all, it's Miss Brett again here to start off Unit 3, which is the American Revolution. And with this unit, the American Revolution, we definitely start to see some familiar terms and some familiar events, especially from 8th grade U.S. history. Now, with the American Revolution, this unit will start in 1763, and that is a very important year. 1763, try to recall what event that year definitely signifies. And with that year, it's the end of the French and Indian War. So remember, the French and Indian War was when the American colonists, specifically George Washington, ended up basically running into the French out in the Ohio River Valley. And when the American colonists and the French ended up running into each other, the British ended up coming in to defend its colonies and especially defend its resources. Now, with the French and Indian War ending in 1763, remember that the British colonies gained all this land, more than doubled in size. And as soon as American colonists began to expand out west, there began conflicts with Native Americans, which ultimately led the king to draw the proclamation of 1763 forbidding colonists to move west. Now, remember that the British never really imposed many daily sanctions or daily actions that forbid them from doing anything. We had that period of salutary neglect where the American colonists basically did whatever they wanted. Well, now after the French and Indian War, we're definitely going to see that the British kind of see the colonists as chaotic, unorganized, just not very well structured. And so after the French and Indian War, British troops don't just leave. They actually stay and they start to impose many new taxes, many new laws that are going to lead to tensions. Salutary neglect is officially over at 1763 with the end of the French and Indian War. And through your reaction chart that you just completed, we see all these actions that the British start imposing on the colonists. Taxes, where they had to pay back debt for the French and Indian War. We start seeing the troops staying within the colonies and also having to be quartered with the Quartering Act, where British troops, in some cases, lived in colonial homes, an invasion of privacy. We also see with the taxes and the tensions building, there were direct actions against the British, like the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. And so by 1775, when Lexington and Concord, which is considered the first battle of the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord, we see these tensions rising, and we see the American colonists really starting to defend themselves against British authority. Now, when Lexington and Concord, the first battles where the British showed up in Massachusetts to confiscate illegal gunpowder that the colonists smuggled, we see these tensions develop and start in Massachusetts, right? Like the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord. Massachusetts was without a doubt the most rebellious state. And if you think back to the founding of Massachusetts, the separatists, the Pilgrims, and the Puritans who broke from the Church of England, they already had some severed ties. It makes sense that the revolution starts in Massachusetts. But not all colonists were as rebellious as Massachusetts. Most colonists in 1775 thought Massachusetts was basically kind of crazy. Most colonists really were loyal to the king at the beginning of the revolution. So with this lecture today, I'm going to take you through the American Revolution, mainly the causes and a lot of the events that took place at the beginning of the revolution, and basically setting the foundation for what now can be called the United States of America. So with the start of the American Revolution, when Lexington and Concord happened in 1775, it basically starts this conflict where the colonists are starting to determine, what is it that we actually want? Do we want full-on independence? Do we want basically some reform from the British? what are we actually declaring? Like, what are we actually fighting for? And so basically in 1775, right after Lexington and Concord, the colonists create and they meet at what's called the Second Continental Congress. Now, they did form and organize the First Continental Congress, and basically they just said, we'll meet if things get worse. Well, things got worse, and so they meet at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, 1775. So Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, 1775. And basically, the delegates there, we had representatives from every single colony at the Second Continental Congress, kind of deciding and determining what exactly is it that we're doing. And so there were some immediate decisions that were made. First of all, the biggest immediate decision was a call to create a military. So the Continental Army was created. This was one of the first immediate decisions, was the Continental Army. And George Washington was appointed to be the commander of the Continental Army. Now, George Washington, think about, right, he had experience from the French and Indian War. He had a lot of benefits because he trained alongside British troops during the French and Indian War. He knew strategies. He knew some of the tactics. And so George Washington was kind of a natural commander. He had experience. He was from Virginia, and he's going to lead the Continental Army. So he has to train people. He has to organize. He has to basically create an entire military to defend the colonies. But the Second Continental Congress had a lot of hesitations, a lot of apprehension as to what exactly are the colonies asking for. So most people, again, at this time, did not want full-on independence. Most people were loyal to the crown. Most people in the colonies were loyal to the king. Think about like mercantilism. Think about the southern colonies that were all there to produce for the crown. Most of the people in the colonies at this time in 1775 are loyal. We call them loyalists because they did not want to break. So to try to create some compromise, to try to create some sort of way to demand change from the king, the Second Continental Congress created the Olive Branch Petition. And with the Olive Branch Petition, it was basically like the last appeal to the king, to King George III. Basically, the Olive Branch Petition, think olive branch, right? It represents peace. The Olive Branch Petition said, hey, King George III, look, things are not going well. They basically were trying to get the king to make compromises, to stop taxing, to stop imposing all these laws. And King George III basically didn't respond. He, again, being a king, thought his colonists, like, this is not an issue. This is not my problem. And he did not respond. So then the Second Continental Congress drafted the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. This declaration of the causes and necessities of taking up arms basically told the British government that they've left the colonists with no choice, that the colonists have to resist. They have to fight back. And they basically are saying that they have to take up arms. So please note that this is not the Declaration of Independence. This document was actually on a DBQ a few years back, and so many students thought it was the Declaration of Independence. If it was the Declaration of Independence, it would say the Declaration of Independence. This was a separate document before that was declaring the causes and necessities to take up arms, basically defending the right of the colonies to fight back. However, over time, we definitely see that there's going to be a shift towards independence. So here we got Commander George Washington ready to take on the Continental Army and fight the British. And the cost of this shift towards independence was definitely something to think about, right? War is not only expensive, but it's also costly to human lives. And so with that cost, a lot of people think, that it's almost justified to fight back because of the major just burdens that the British are forcing upon the colonists. So yes, the cost of war is definitely going to be high, but many people felt that it was justified, that war should be defended. Okay. Without a doubt, the British continued to act against the colonists. And we saw in the British actions and the colonial reactions that there was a lot of British policies, right? Taxes where the colonists were having to pay to British Parliament. Having to house the British soldiers. We definitely see that the British actions were extreme and they're just getting worse. One thing that the British did that definitely upset the colonists was they actually recruited Native Americans to fight. And get this, they also recruited African slaves. So remember, the loyalists who were down south, who didn't want to break from the king, who were basically thinking that this was just a Massachusetts problem, all of a sudden now the crown is trying to take the slaves, the African slaves, to fight for the British. This is going to cause many Southerners to say, hold on a minute, and rethink this whole independence movement. But without a doubt, what caused the biggest shift towards independence was Common Sense. Common Sense was a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine. So Common Sense was written by Thomas Paine. And this was the biggest shift towards independence. Thomas Paine basically argued in this pamphlet that basically the British have left the colonists with no other option, that basically independence is inevitable. And so Thomas Paine basically argued that reconciling or basically apologizing, moving on with the British was impossible. It was impossible to reconcile with the British. He's basically arguing in this that overthrowing the British crown was justified. One of his arguments was, if you have an abusive ruler, you have the right to overthrow them. So if you have an abusive ruler, you have the right to overthrow them. This was justifying the notions for independence. And in the end, over 100,000 copies of Common Sense were published. And if we equivalated that today, it would be about 8 million copies. This went viral. Everyone was reading it. And slowly but surely, people started to change their attitudes towards independence. Now, I'm going to put a little side note. I always like to be the devil's advocate to make you think. I want you to think about what would happen if a slave read this pamphlet. If you have an abusive ruler, you have the right to overthrow them, right? We definitely see in the American Revolution, there's going to be a lot of hypocritical and troubles with defining freedom. Everyone has a different definition of freedom still to this day. And so Thomas Paine's Common Sense really started to make people question, what if a slave actually read this pamphlet? And so laws, slave codes against literacy were getting more popular, definitely trying to prevent slaves from reading and writing so that if they couldn't run into this literature. So with that being said, eventually the Second Continental Congress will, in fact, draft and approve the Declaration of Independence. So let's talk about the Declaration of Independence and talk about this document and who's responsible for it and what this sets up for the future United States of America. So the document itself was written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was only 33 years old, from Virginia, and young but very intelligent and a great writer. His rhetoric was pretty fascinating. And he was pressured to write this Declaration of Independence. Because if you think about it, if Thomas Jefferson writes that he is declaring independence from Great Britain, his name is on it. This is treason. And so he was very nervous about actually imposing this declaration, very nervous about having his name on it. But he was pressured and he was helped by his friends, John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. So Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin were really the primary drafters of the document itself. But Thomas Jefferson's kind of given the most credit because he's the one who really wrote most of it. Now, with this document, a lot of it really does embrace the Enlightenment philosophies, especially of John Locke. John Locke, who created the social contract, basically this idea that the purpose of government is to protect life, liberty, and property. Like that is the goal of government, that all humans are born with these inalienable rights and they must be protected. So with that, Thomas Jefferson is going to draft this document using a lot of John Locke's language. And the document itself is going to basically be divided into two parts. The opening part of the document, of the Declaration of Independence, is all about the explanation as to why the colonists are doing this. Thomas Jefferson is justifying these actions. He is justifying the colonists declaring independence in the first part. And then the second part of the document is basically a list of grievances, a list of complaints against the king and against British Parliament. So this document basically has two parts. One is the explanation, the justification for why the colonists are declaring independence. And then it's a list of grievances, the problems that they had towards the crown. Now, this is the Declaration of Independence. It actually is very short. It's not super long, pretty straightforward and to the point. But with it, it does have some contradictory statements. For example, Thomas Jefferson in the opening sentence declared quite a bit of radical speech for this time period. So to read the opening line of the Declaration, he states that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That line alone is a very radical statement, especially for this time. And claiming that all men are created equal. What does that actually mean, right? Women are saying, well, what about us? Minorities are saying, well, what about us? Poor people are saying, well, what about us? To state that all men are created equal is a very difficult statement to make in 1776, where slavery exists, women have no rights, poor people have no rights. But this is a statement that Thomas Jefferson makes that will be forever an American ideal that we are still trying to fight for today. Now, he then goes on to quote basically John Locke, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that the government is to protect these unalienable rights, and that these rights cannot be taken away. Okay. Now, this opening statement, again, extremely dramatic, extremely radical. And with the Declaration of Independence, we definitely start to see some responses to it. Like, what does this actually mean that all men are created equal? Now, with the document itself, it does end up getting drafted, and it does end up getting approved by the 13 colonies. Second Continental Congress will vote to ratify it, and it was actually had to be modified. The original document, Thomas Jefferson actually talked about how the colonists were slaves to the British crown. Now, Thomas Jefferson did own slaves. Thomas Jefferson was from Virginia, from the South. And when he made the colonists equivalent to slaves, a lot of Southerners were like, I don't want to sign this. Because if the colonists are slaves that have to be freed from the British crown, then the African slaves have to be freed from the white plantation owners. And so Thomas Jefferson actually had to remove that from the Declaration of Independence to get the Southern colonies to ratify it. Now, without a doubt, one of the biggest responses to the Declaration of Independence comes from the people who don't feel any form of equality. One of those definitely is going to be the women. Remember the ladies becomes a major famous quote from Abigail Adams. So while Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams are writing this document as colonists for independence, Abigail Adams and John Adams had tons of letters back and forth to each other, and we actually have a lot of them on file still. And Abigail Adams basically urged her husband, while he's drafting this declaration, to remember the ladies. That when you're going to claim this equality statement, don't forget about the ladies. So she says, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That's a pretty dramatic thing for a woman to say to her husband at this time in our culture. And the fact that Abigail Adams is basically saying, if you don't include us, women will rebel. Like, you're having rebellion against the crown right now. Well, you're going to have a rebellion from the women on your hands if you do not remember the ladies. And unfortunately, women were left out. And of course, with Hamilton, right, they're going to urge Thomas Jefferson to include women in the sequel. So with this, we definitely see the Declaration of Independence pose so many questions. All men are created equal. Well, who does that include and who does that exclude? Because we definitely see at this time in the history of the United States, the future United States, it was very limited. So just to kind of go through the major events of the American Revolution as the foundations are being established, as the documents are being established by the Second Continental Congress. After the colonies declare war, now it's like, now what, right? They're going to have to form a government. They're going to have to form some structure. We're going to see that the colonies are going to have to create so many new things that they really don't have any example to follow by. So just to kind of go through the main causes, just to review the main causes of the American Revolution, remember the big economic causes basically are going to be mercantilism. Mercantilism is kind of that long-term cause that's been on and on since the foundations of the colonies. That idea that the colonists are just there to produce for the king, right? Like Thomas Jefferson said, the colonists are slaves to the British king. So mercantilism is that long-term cause that's going to lead to resentment, right? And then also these restrictive laws, right? Definitely these ideas of taxation, the economic burden of taxes that Parliament was imposing. Now, the colonists had always paid taxes. The colonists paid taxes to their representatives in the colonies, right? Every colony had their own representative body. They were fine paying taxes where they had representation, but there was no representation of colonists back in Parliament. So no colonist was representing the colonies in British Parliament, yet Parliament was taxing the colonists like crazy to pay off debt and basically make the colonists pay back from what the French and Indian War cost. As far as political causes, without a doubt, we definitely see this change in political just restriction, right? The fact that the proclamation did not allow the colonists to move west. The French and Indian War is going to force the British to keep imposing a lot of political laws and policies and enforcing them. But then we also see a lot of ideological shifts. And the ideological shifts, without a doubt, the Enlightenment, new way of thinking about government, new way of thinking about human rights, new way of thinking about monarchy, right? And then we also saw the Great Awakening in the colonies, which definitely caused a major ideological shift. Now that people are challenging church authority, right, thinking more independently, we definitely see these causes lead to eventually the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. So to kind of go through a timeline of the major events of the American Revolution, like I said, military history is not really covered heavy in AP curriculum, but I think it's good to know the order of events, right? Like to know kind of a timeline. So we talked about the first battles heard, the first shots heard around the world was Lexington and Concord. The British soldiers heard that there was smuggled illegal gunpowder in Massachusetts, and they basically came in to take it, which then led to the formation of the Second Continental Congress and finally declaring independence. So Battle of Bunker Hill, we also see with the British and the colonists. And the hard thing with the military in the American Revolution was the colonists were so behind. The American colonists had nothing on the British. The British military was 3 times larger than what the American population was. So the fact that we see this huge military from the British with advanced weaponry, trained, ready to fight, and then these colonists who basically were just trained by George Washington, definitely seeing that the battles were there was an unfair advantage of the British. And traditional battles back then were very just, you showed up, you fought, and you kept marching until you killed off one side. So the colonists are going to have to resort to what we call guerrilla warfare, ambushing the British by surprise to try to fight back. Okay. So when Washington takes on the Continental Army, we're going to definitely see, Washington using this surprise tactics, this guerrilla warfare, to catch the British off guard. And we then get the Declaration formalized in 1776. Moving along, the Battle of Saratoga was really the first battle that the American colonists considered to be a win. It's a brutal battle. Both sides lost tremendous amount, but it is considered to be a battle for the American victory for the American colonists. And this war itself was just harsh. It was a lot about resupplying your troops, resupplying your military. And we definitely see the biggest turning point. What really saved the American colonists was the fact that the French are going to start allying with the colonists. Now, the French and the British have beef from way back, right? And the French kind of find this as like fun, like the American colonists are rising up against their mother country. So the French start to supply the American colonists with weapons and so forth, and they're eventually going to get involved. This was greatly due to Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was in France securing this alliance, okay? So then we definitely see the war started off in Massachusetts. We saw some in the middle colonies with Saratoga and so forth. And then we start to see it kind of moving down to the South, where a lot of Southern loyalists are really turning their ideology towards independence. So we again are seeing guerrilla warfare as the main tactic for American colonists to try to win. And with the fact that the French are going to be allied with the American forces, the Battle of Yorktown is considered the final battle of the American Revolution. The Battle of Yorktown in Virginia is where the French Navy show up to fight alongside the American colonists and ultimately force the British to surrender. Now, with the American Revolution, without a doubt, if the French alliance was not there, if the French Navy did not show up, this war would have gone on for much longer. That alliance with the French was key for American colonial victory. So just to show some of the military challenges, because this war was difficult. I mean, I know we're covering it here in like 5 minutes, but this was definitely a challenge, but it definitely felt more, it was kind of unifying the colonists in a way, because the military challenges for the colonists were the fact that they did not have a big population. They did not have a trained military. George Washington was trying so hard to organize and to train and to fight back, but in the end, with the American Revolution, just to show you the casualties from compared to other wars in the U.S. history, the American Revolution lost around 25,000 American lives. And it was definitely one of those events that mothers, parents, sisters, people feared because their young boys were being sent off to war. Young boys. I mean, this was where we see a lot of young teenagers going to fight. And so, with the Revolutionary War, definitely a challenge that ends up resulting in the Battle of Yorktown and the ultimate surrender of Great Britain. So, with that being said, what we're going to talk about next class is how the American colonists pulled off the biggest stunt in history. No one was betting on the colonists to defeat the British Empire. And so the fact that these colonists did the impossible, now the colonists need to figure out, how are we going to govern ourselves? How are we going to actually start a brand new country?